I now give the floor to Ms. Ilse Brands-Kiedis.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the humanitarian and human rights situation for Palestinian civilians across Gaza is catastrophic. According to figures verified by our office, close to 70% of those killed in Gaza by strikes, shelling, and other hostilities were children and women. The age group most represented in verified fatalities was children from 5 to 9 years old. According to the Ministry of Health of the State of Palestine, at least 43,000 people have been killed since the horrific attacks by Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups on Israel on the 7th of October last year. More than 100,000 people have been injured. These numbers are likely to be a serious understatement, as many of those killed and injured remain under the rubble. Nearly 1.9 million people have been displaced, many repeatedly, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, older people, and children. Israeli strikes on shelters and residential buildings continue to kill unconscionable numbers of civilians, women, men, young and old. Attacks on so-called safe zones prove that nowhere in Gaza is safe. Monitoring by our office indicates that this unprecedented level of killing and injury of civilians is a direct consequence of the party's choice of methods and means of warfare and their failure to comply with fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. The pattern of strikes indicate that the Israeli Defense Forces have systematically violated fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attack. Palestinian armed groups have also conducted hostilities in ways that have likely contributed to harm to civilians. Israel's conduct of hostilities has destroyed Gaza's civilian infrastructure, including places that have protected status under international law, hospitals, schools, and vital services, including electricity, water, and sewage. This contributes directly to the famine risk being discussed today. Israel has killed hundreds of medical personnel, civilian police, journalists, and humanitarian aid workers, including more than 220 of our own United Nations staff. Thousands of Palestinians have been taken from Gaza to Israel, usually shackled and blindfolded to be held incommunicado. Meanwhile, there is constant and continued interference with the entry and distribution of humanitarian assistance, which has fallen to some of the lowest levels in a year. As the occupying power, Israel is obliged under international law to protect Palestinian civilians and to provide them with supplies essential to their survival. Yet, the cumulative impact of more than a year of destruction in Gaza has taken an enormous toll. Basic services for Palestinians in Gaza, the fabric of society, have been decimated. Conditions of life, particularly in northern Gaza, are increasingly not fit for survival. Mr. President, turning specifically to the situation in northern Gaza, the latest report from the respected and independent Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, warns there is a strong likelihood that famine is imminent. This horrific possibility cannot be separated from the unrelenting attacks on the human rights of civilians there. Over the past 5 weeks, the Israeli military has conducted strikes that have led to massive civilian fatalities in northern Gaza, particularly impacting women, children, older people, the sick, and people with disabilities, many of whom are reportedly trapped by Israeli military restrictions and attacks on escape routes. The pattern and the frequency of these reported attacks suggest the systematic targeting of locations known or which should have been known as sheltering significant numbers of civilians, coupled with the continued use of weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We have warned repeatedly that this has led to disproportionate civilian fatalities. The Israeli military has also conducted repeated attacks on the 3 major hospitals in the area, and on other vital infrastructure, while unlawfully restricting the entry and distribution of humanitarian assistance to northern Gaza. Already, OHCHR has documented how by April of this year, the severe restrictions imposed by Israel on the entry and distribution of goods and services necessary for the survival of the civilian population brought the risk of famine and starvation to Gaza. We again recall that the use of starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. Just recently, the High Commissioner for Human Rights presented a detailed analysis of violations between November 2023 and April 2024. The report's conclusions call for a reckoning with the serious allegations of violations of international law. The manner in which the Israeli military is conducting operations in northern Gaza suggests not only that Israel's actions are seeking to empty northern Gaza of Palestinians by displacing survivors to the south, but points to further grave risks of atrocities of the most serious nature. Palestinian armed groups must also comply with international humanitarian law, including refraining from deliberately co-locating military objectives with civilians and civilian infrastructure, and must take all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population under their control from the effects of attacks. But failure by Palestinian armed groups to comply with international humanitarian law does not remove or reduce the obligation of Israeli forces to comply. Mr. President, all states consistent with their obligations under international law must therefore assess arms sales or transfers and provisions of military, logistical, or financial support to a party to the conflict, with a view to ending such support if this risks serious violations of international law. As the High Commissioner has repeatedly said, the violence must stop immediately. The hostages and those arbitrarily detained must be released. We must rush humanitarian aid into Gaza by all routes and restore essential services immediately. And there must be accountability, due reckoning with respect to the allegations of serious violations of international law through credible and impartial judicial authorities. The risks are very real and very immediate. The IPC has called for action in days, not weeks. We call on this Council to take all steps within its powers under the Charter to influence the parties to end violations, facilitate impartial humanitarian access, and protect civilians. This horrific war must end. In line with the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion and General Assembly Resolution ES 10/24, Israel must end its continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, allowing the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination. The only sustainable solution to this conflict is by forging a path that gives Palestinians and Israelis the chance to live side by side in peace, equality, and dignity. Thank you.
Thank Ms. Blans-Keres for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Lane Paulson.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the food security situation in northern Gaza is dire, and the latest indications are deeply troubling. Already in October, nearly 133,000 people faced catastrophic food insecurity, and the integrated food security phase classification released on 17th of October warned that under a reasonable worst-case scenario, a risk of famine existed for the whole of the Gaza Strip between November 2024 and April 2025. It also projected the population classified in IPC Phase 5, that is catastrophe, would nearly triple in the coming months. As emphasized by ASG Keres, there is nothing reasonable in what has unfolded in recent weeks. The conflict has intensified, and so has the damage to objects indispensable to civilian survival. Last Friday, the Independent Famine Review Committee issued an alert following significant developments since the conclusion of the last IPC analysis. The Famine Review Committee has found a strong likelihood that famine is occurring or imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. Men, women, boys, and girls are effectively starving as the conflict rages, with humanitarian organizations blocked from delivering assistance to those in need. Excellencies, agri-food systems have collapsed in the Gaza Strip. Local food production has been decimated. Recent geospatial analyses indicate that nearly 70% of the cropland, which has contributed up to 1/3 of daily consumption, has been damaged or destroyed since the escalation in hostilities started last year. Likewise, animal production has been devastated, with almost 95% of cattle and more than half of sheep and goat herds now dead. These animal losses have both removed access to critical and nutritious sources of protein and milk, as well as devastated people's livelihoods. The satellite images from recent geospatial assessments indicate that heavy vehicle tracks, razing, shelling, and other conflict-related pressures have damaged large areas of farmland, infrastructure, wells, and other productive infrastructure for agricultural activities in the Gaza Strip. Khan Yunis has the largest and most impacted cultivated area in terms of surface area, while North Gaza has the highest proportion of damage per governorate. It is important to highlight that prior to the 7th of October 2023, Gaza was largely self-sufficient in vegetables, eggs, fresh milk, poultry, and fish. Local agriculture also produced much of the red meat and fresh fruits consumed inside Gaza. Domestic production of these fresh, nutritious, but perishable foods meant that Gazan children's nutritional outcomes were similar to those of children in middle-income countries, despite high levels of food insecurity. Local agriculture is first and foremost crucial for providing balanced nutrition for the entire population. It is also a source of income and provides a dignified life for those working in the agricultural and food production sector. A functioning local agri-food system is crucial to minimize the concerning levels of acute food insecurity and malnutrition across the Gaza Strip. The significant levels of damage to agri-food systems are exacerbating the humanitarian and hunger crisis on the ground and increasing the risk of famine. Food supply across the entire Gaza Strip has sharply deteriorated, while food availability is at an all-time low. Excellencies, when people cannot produce or access food, they will suffer increasingly extreme levels of acute malnutrition. People in Gaza have been experiencing this for more than a year. This is the 5th time that the Famine Review Committee has met in 1 year, a first in the history of the IPC classification, on the situation in the Gaza Strip. We can and must save lives. This is a humanitarian imperative, and it is our moral responsibility. People urgently need food, water, medical aid, and other essential humanitarian assistance. By the time famine has been declared, people are already dying of hunger, with irreversible consequences that can last generations. The window of opportunity to deliver this assistance is now, today, not tomorrow. Alongside food assistance, agricultural aid is vitally needed to restore availability of highly nutritious food, prevent the sector's total collapse, preserve remaining agricultural livelihoods, and curb acute hunger and malnutrition. Gaza's farmers, fishers, and livestock owners are risking their lives to continue production. But this is becoming impossible due to the restrictions and bans on imports of food production inputs and the substantial damages suffered by production infrastructure. FAO is ready to further scale up its efforts to respond to and mitigate famine and prevent its spread in the Gaza Strip through additional support for remaining livestock and to enable local food production where possible. Today, we renew the call for urgent diplomatic efforts from across the international community to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including famine in the Gaza Strip, and for Council members to remind all parties to the conflict of their responsibility to protect civilian infrastructure critical to the delivery of humanitarian aid and to ensure the proper functioning of agri-food systems and markets in situations of armed conflict, in respect to adhering to obligations under international humanitarian law. Immediate and unlimited safe access to people who are in need is indispensable to save lives and prevent famine. A ceasefire is urgently needed. We cannot forget that peace is a prerequisite for food security, and the right to food is a fundamental human right. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Paulson for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Misua.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the catastrophic situation in Gaza. Thank you also to our colleagues from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Food and Agriculture Organization. We unequivocally share the serious concerns they have expressed today. Since the escalation of this conflict in October 2023, we have briefed this Council on no fewer than 16 occasions. We have condemned the death, destruction, and dehumanization of civilians in Gaza who have been driven from their homes, stripped of their sense of place and dignity, forced to witness their family members killed, burned, and buried alive. Injured children have had the words "wounded child," "no surviving family" penned on their arms. Most of Gaza is now a wasteland of rubble. What distinction was made and what precautions were taken if more than 70% of civilian housing is either damaged or destroyed? Essential commercial goods and services, including electricity, have been all but cut off. This has led to increasing hunger, starvation, and now, as we have heard, potentially famine. We are witnessing acts reminiscent of the gravest international crimes. Mr. President, the latest offensive that Israel started in North Gaza last month is an intensified, extreme, and accelerated version of the horrors of the past year. Shelters, homes, and schools have been burned and bombed to the ground. Numerous families remain trapped under rubble because fuel for digging equipment is being blocked by the Israeli authorities, and first responders have been blocked from reaching them. Ambulances have been destroyed, and hospitals have come under attack. Supplies to the north are being cut off, and people are being pushed farther south. The daily cruelty we see in Gaza seems to have no limits. Beit Hanun has been besieged for more than 1 month. Yesterday, food and water reached shelters, but today, Israeli soldiers forcibly displaced people from those same areas. People under siege now tell us they are afraid that they will be targeted if they receive help. As I brief you, Israeli authorities are blocking humanitarian assistance from entering North Gaza, where fighting continues and around 75,000 people remain with dwindling water and food supplies. Conditions of life across Gaza are unfit for human survival. Food is insufficient. Shelter items needed ahead of winter are in extremely short supply. Violent armed lootings of our convoys have become increasingly organized along routes from Kerem Shalom, driven by the collapse of public order and safety. Many food assistance kitchens have been forced to close. In October, daily food distribution shrunk by nearly 25% compared to September. These are not logistical problems. They can be solved with the right political will. The Israeli military's announcement that the Kisl film crossing into central Gaza has opened cannot come soon enough. However, our capacity to respond is being undermined, including by the Israeli Knesset legislation to ban UNRWA activities starting in January. If implemented, this bill will be another devastating blow to efforts to provide life-saving aid and avert the threat of famine. No other organization can fill these gaps. Mr. President, we also remain concerned about the deteriorating situation of Palestinians in the West Bank. Israeli forces continue to employ lethal tactics that appear to defy law enforcement standards, and they're causing damage to water and sewage networks and other infrastructure. The demolition of Palestinian-owned homes also continues. On 5th November, 9 homes were demolished in the Silwan area outside Jerusalem's Old City, displacing 42 people, nearly half of them children, to make way for an illegal settlement-related project. Israeli settlers continue attacks on Palestinians and their property, with more than 160 incidents related to the olive harvest documented in October alone, the majority resulting in casualties or property damage. Movement restrictions are making civilian access to essential services, particularly healthcare, increasingly challenging in refugee camps and in Area C, where humanitarian partners are scaling up to support communities in meeting needs. Mr. President, the most basic requirements of humanity are being disregarded. These are requirements that members of this Council, and indeed all member states, set out in international humanitarian and human rights law. They must be respected. Constant care must be taken to spare civilians throughout military operations. Civilians must be allowed to seek protection elsewhere, and they must be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return as international law demands. Reports indicating that people would not be allowed to return should be of grave concern to this Council. Parties must ensure that civilians' essential needs are met and must facilitate unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they are. Hostages and those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately, and in the interim, they must be treated humanely and allowed visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Indiscriminate rocket fire towards Israel must stop. There must be accountability for international crimes. The provisional orders of the International Court of Justice in the case on the application of the Genocide Convention in the Gaza Strip and the determinations in its advisory opinion of July 2024 must be implemented now. Mr. President, now is the time for member states to use their leverage to prevent and stop violations of international humanitarian law through diplomatic and economic pressure, responsible arms transfer, and combating impunity. Now is the time for the Security Council to use its powers under the UN Charter to ensure compliance with international law and full implementation of its resolutions. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msua for her briefing.